Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. The Picture of Dorian Gray. By Oscar Wilde. Lippincott's monthly magazine published a censored version of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray in July 1890. Even when it was heavily altered, the article nonetheless sparked such moral outrage among critics that many called for his death. Wilde published a book version in 1891, which included a foreword justifying the play. Art for the sake of art, he argued. Wilde compared himself to Basil Hallward rather than Lord Henry, one of the book's central characters. A gorgeous, narcissistic young man is the protagonist of The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde's sole novel to date. To maintain his dominance, he lives in a culture where attractiveness is a harsh measure of one's worth. Lord Henry Wotton and artist Basil Hallward are the good angels and evil devils on either side of his life, guiding him in the right direction. Basil's image of Dorian seems to capture his spirit, so when Dorian wishes that his portrait would age, the devil takes notice. While Dorian's photograph displays the effects of his hedonistic lifestyle, he does not. When Basil, his best buddy, is killed, he commits the ultimate sin. After that, he's doomed to fail. Dorian tries to destroy the picture out of fear that it would be discovered, but he ends up destroying himself in the process. The Picture of Dorian Gray begins with two prefaces. There are two prefaces to the narrative, one written by the artist Basil Hallward, who depicted a young man, and one written by Oscar Wilde, who wrote the story. One day, an attractive young man came into Hallward's studio for a portrait. Wilde happened to be in town at the time and expressed his regret that the youngster would be forced to grow old and lose his youthful appearance. Offhandedly, the artist mused that it was a shame that the boy couldn't stay young and let the picture age. He adds that Oscar got pensive and left soon afterward. Then, approximately a year after that, he finds a copy of the book. All art is very pointless, concludes Oscar Wilde's prologue to his novel. It begins in Basil Hallward's studio, where he works on a piece of art. They are enjoying Basil's latest work with Lord Henry Wotton, the reprobate. It depicts a stunningly handsome young man. She has blonde hair and blue eyes, and her whole being exudes joy and happiness. Despite Lord Henry's nagging, Basil refuses to display the picture. A strange creative worship he has for Dorian, the youngster in the painting, prevents him from showing it publicly. Dorian Gray and Basil met at a party, and Basil was afraid. At their first meeting, he realized that something dreadful was about to happen in his life. Dorian's obsession with him and his desire to portray him may have stemmed from his dread to paint a portrait of his ethereal beauty. He now sees Dorian on a daily basis and credits the youngster as his primary source of motivation. The name is familiar to Lord Henry. His aunt, Lady Agatha, informed him that Dorian Gray had agreed to aid her with a charity initiative in the East End. Beautiful nature, she gushed. Basil is certain that Lord Henry and Dorian never meet. Lord Henry is a horrible influence on the young guy, and he's right about that. Dorian arrives just as the butler is speaking this to Lord Henry. Basil begins working on the painting after grudgingly introducing Dorian to Lord Henry. Basil takes a break from painting to warn Dorian about Lord Henry's depravity. For the first time in Basil's life, Dorian begs Lord Henry to stay as Basil paints so that he might get to know him better. He asks Dorian to go for a walk in the garden while Basil works on finishing touches to the painting that don't require the model. Lord Henry is sharing his thoughts with the young man as they stroll. He tells Dorian that youth and beauty are fleeting and that he should enjoy every moment of it while he can. His desire is for him to always seek out fresh experiences rather than engage in the typical pursuits of guys. A more hedonistic route is something the man desires for the boy. When Basil summons the men back inside, Dorian continues to pose for the camera. Lord Henry feels the artwork is the most beautiful he's ever seen, but Dorian is overcome with sadness when he sees it. After considering Lord Henry's words and how the painting will age with him, he concludes that the artwork will remain youthful and he will, too. He believes he'd be willing to sacrifice his soul if it meant the picture could mature while he remained a youthful artist. This upsets Dorian so much that he tells Basil, "Baby, you must love the artwork more than you love your friends." Dorian says he plans to kill himself when he realizes he's getting old because no one would ever love him. Because of this, Basil offers to destroy the picture, but Dorian has other ideas. He has changed his mind and now intends to take it. However, despite Basil's protests, he decides to accompany Lord Henry to the play, since he had already agreed to do so. Basil slumps over the sofa after they go, his face contorted in pain. Lord Henry pays a visit to his uncle the following day, a pleasant but rough-mannered old guy. Lord Henry inquires whether he knows anything about Dorian's whereabouts. When Henry's uncle, Lord Fermor, informs him about Dorian's tragic story, he breaks down. After marrying a destitute soldier, his mother was stripped of her inheritance. Her father had the man slain just days before Dorian was born at the behest of the man's father. Her death soon followed, and Dorian was forced to live with his terrible grandfather. A romantic, Lord Henry is eager to spend more time with Dorian after reading the narrative. Dorian will be dominated by him, and he wants him to feel the same way about him as Basil does about Dorian. His aunt Agatha lives down the street from their uncle's house, so Lord Henry decides to leave. There are a few noblemen and women in attendance who are discussing their charity endeavors. Dorian is one of them. Over lunch, Henry makes a few disparaging remarks about the group's job as a whole. Except for sorrow, he continues, I can relate with everything. It's too unpleasant and distressing for him, he says more emphatically. Instead of focusing on the negative aspects of life, he encourages them to look at the positive aspects. Humanity takes itself way too seriously. It's the original sin of the universe. History may have turned out differently if the caveman had learned to laugh as a matter of fact. Henry's acerbic remarks are met with laughter rather than astonishment by the gathering. Dorian whispers to him as he prepares to depart, urging him to join him. Henry tells him that he was scheduled to go see Basil, but Dorian takes Henry's advice and heads out the door with the king. Dorian arrives at Lord Henry's house a month later and waits for him to arrive. In the meantime, Dorian and Henry's wife, Victoria, are chatting about music. However, she ended up looking disorderly as a result of her efforts. After hearing one of Lord Henry's witticisms repeated by his wife, Dorian, he remarks that this is the only way she knows anything about him. Dorian can't wait to tell Lord Henry about his new love when he comes. Dorian claims to have followed Henry's counsel and gone out and lived life to the fullest. He was stopped by a theatre owner while walking through a sketchy part of London. Dorian met Sybil Vane when he entered the building. She's a Shakespearean actor who portrays the heroine. She refers to him as Prince Charming after she first sees him. For not informing Henry that only actresses were worthy of his affection, Dorian chastises him. As a result, Dorian regrets telling Henry about Sybil, knowing full well that Henry will tease him. Dorian, you couldn't have been more helpful in telling me. You'll tell me everything you do for the rest of your life. They decide to go to see Juliet and Romeo and Juliet the following night. Also, they plan to invite Basil along. Henry is informed by Dorian that Basil has sent him the framed portrait. Lord Henry reflects about how much Dorian intrigues him as he gets ready to go out that night. His reaction to Dorian's new love is not one of envy but one of schadenfreude. Henry goes home later that night to find a note from Dorian announcing that he and Sybil are engaged. The fifth chapter begins in the Vane home. Dancing on the stars, Sybil has found true love. If a man has a lot of money, her mother thinks that's the best option for her daughter. Is it possible that James, Sybil's older brother, has doubts? He is going to embark on a voyage to Australia as a professional sailor. In order to protect Sybil while he is away, James asks his mother to keep an eye on her. As a result, James wants to talk about his sister's fiancé when they go for a walk. Even though she calls him Prince Charming and promises that she will adore him forever, she won't reveal Dorian's real name. James has vowed to kill the man if he damages her. James confronts his mother about his father once they arrive home. It was a gentleman, but he had a wife, she says. She and Sybil wouldn't have to work if he had lived to provide for them. So that Sybil doesn't suffer the same fate, James instructs his mother to keep a close eye on her. James confronts his mother about his father once they arrive home. It was a gentleman, but he had a wife, she says. She and Sybil wouldn't have to work if he had lived to provide for them. So that Sybil doesn't suffer the same fate, James instructs his mother to keep a close eye on her. Before he boards the ship, James makes a new vow: if the Prince Charming harms Sybil, he will murder him. During the course of a dinner conversation between Basil and Lord Henry, Henry informs Basil about Dorian's engagement. He feels it's a bad idea for Dorian to marry someone so low in the social pecking order. Henry, on the other hand, is content to wait and see what happens. At that point the three men leave the theater to witness Dorian's latest play about Sybil, who he extols as a virtue. Sybil's performance that night at the theater is abject. He goes backstage to find out what transpired after the show. She is, nevertheless, overjoyed. Because she didn't have any emotions of her own, she used to be able to adapt the feelings of the characters she played. But now that she's in love, she can't fake the feelings of the characters anymore because she's so happy and content with her life. Hearing this, Dorian comes to the realization that his love for her was based solely on her acting abilities. Consequently, he brutally quits their relationship. A vicious sneer appears on the face of his picture when he arrives home, and Dorian is horrified by his own selfishness. The next day, he resolves to make amends with Sybil. Lord Henry shows up the next morning and tells Dorian that Sybil had committed suicide the night before, when he was studying the change in his portrait. Dorian feels compelled to report the death to the authorities, but Lord Henry persuades him that her death was merely the final expression of her art, and that she was never a real person at all. To begin with, Dorian agrees with him on the matter of Sybil, and then on the matter of pursuing pleasure while he is still young enough to do it. The fact that the painting will depict the ravages of time, rather than his own pristine self, makes this all the more compelling. After that, the two men head to the opera together. Despite Basil's best efforts, Dorian appears unmoved when Basil shows up the following day with his sympathies. Dorian echoes some of Lord Henry's criticisms of her. To help him remember her, he asks Basil to sketch a picture of her. When Basil sees the portrait, he inquires about it. Dorian intervenes and stops him from removing the cover, telling him he doesn't want it displayed anywhere and that he will be furious with him if he ever touches it. Dorian refuses to let Basil paint him again. It is carried upstairs to an old schoolroom that is no longer in use and locked away once Basil leaves. His disgrace would never be seen by anyone because no one would be able to look at the portraits there. Dorian has his key in his pocket and sees the daily newspaper with a note from Lord Henry and a yellow-covered book. As a tribute to Sybil, Dorian tears up a piece in the newspaper announcing her death, while reading about a debauched Frenchman in a novel. Dorian is fascinated and settles in to read it. It is Dorian's decision to follow the book's advice. At night he indulges in every vice he can discover, while during the day he tries to keep up with the latest fads and trends. He's fascinated by esotericism, Darwinism, and antinomianism, or the defiance of morality. He lives a life of excess. For years he has spent his time experimenting with many senses. He acquired various perfumes and musical instruments from around the world while he indulged in his sense of scent. He amassed a sizable collection of jewelry when he developed an interest in it, and he once attended a fancy dress event wearing a suit entirely made of pearls. Dorian bumps into Basil on the street on the eve of his 38th birthday. Initially, he tries to ignore the man, but Basil's call compels him to do so. Before departing for Paris, Basil tells Dorian that he wishes to inform him of suspicions that have been spreading about him. With his stunning good looks he says that these rumors are false, just look at him now. You cannot be doing anything wrong if you can see your sins on your face. Basil isn't completely convinced by what he's saying. He realizes that Dorian is no longer the innocent child he once knew, and he longs to peer into the depths of his soul. Dorian offers to show him his soul if he asks for it, and he does. Dorian brings Basil to see the portrait. Basil is disgusted and demands an explanation from the narrator. For example, when Dorian and Lord Henry were talking about the fleeting nature of youth and beauty, Dorian swears to the devil his soul would be damned for ever being born and never having seen the artwork. Dorian agrees to Basil's request that he destroy the obscene painting and pray to God for forgiveness. Angry, Dorian shoots and kills Basil. Dorian reaches out to Alan Campbell, a chemist, the next day. Despite Dorian's admission that he killed the man, Alan refuses to dispose of the body upstairs. When Dorian threatens him with a life-or-death situation, Alan finally backs down. The story hints that the two men were lovers. Dorian returns to the picture and discovers an even more heinous sight. What was the vile crimson dew that glittered, wet and shimmering, on one of the hands, as though the canvas had sweated blood? Dorian removes the painting's cover, allowing Alan to bring up the necessary tools for disposing of the corpse. Dorian attends a dinner party hosted by a noblewoman later that evening. The only reason he continues to listen is because Lord Henry is on his way. Upon Dorian's arrival, the man finds that he is disengaged. In spite of her best efforts, Dorian is unable to convince the hostess that he has feelings for her. When Lord Henry begins to inquire about Dorian's whereabouts the night before, he loses his cool and walks away. Dorian chooses to visit an opium den after returning home with some opiates. A cab takes him to a seedier district of London, where he changes into street clothes. Lord Henry's mantra, to cure the soul by means of senses, and the senses by means of soul, is recited by him as he walks. An old friend, a young guy Dorian may blame for his own demise, Adrian Singleton, is in the opium den with Dorian. He tries to persuade Adrian to accompany him out of the house, but he rejects the idea. Then a woman tries to flirt with Dorian, but he dismisses her. When he urges her not to refer to him as Prince Charming, she calls him the Devil's Deal. When he hears the name, a nearby sailor gets to his feet and chases him away. It is the sailor's quick grip and imminent death threat that catches Dorian off guard after he has been pursuing the preoccupied boy. His name is James, and he has vowed to kill Sybil's boyfriend, who is currently on the run. But Dorian convinces him that his sister died 18 years ago, and he doesn't look a day over 20, so it couldn't be him. In the opium den, the woman informs James that Dorian made her what she is now, and she wishes James had murdered him 18 years earlier. The devil bought Dorian's soul so he could preserve his youthful features, she claims. Because he had been looking for so long, James is enraged. Dorian thinks he sees James in the window of his country estate a week later while entertaining friends. Fearful of leaving the house for a few days, he joins his guests for a hunting party when he eventually does. A gun fired by one of his visitors kills a man who was previously unknown to them. When Dorian later checks out the deceased man, he recognizes him as James Vane and concludes that he's safe for the time being. Dorian returns to see Lord Henry a few weeks later to inform him that he has made a decision to mend his ways. A man who has previously tried to seduce a young woman has now decided not to do so again, and is ready to change his ways. It doesn't take long until Lord Henry scoffs at that remark, then wants to talk about the death of Alan Campbell and Basil's mysterious departure. When Dorian asks Lord Henry what he would say if he admitted to killing someone, Lord Henry responds by saying that Dorian would never do anything so shameful. Checking the painting, Dorian finds only a look of cunning, and in the mouth the curved wrinkle of a hypocrite, but no sign of his decision to change. Dorian has made up his mind to destroy the artwork since he believes it is the sole tangible proof of his heinous deeds. Dorian assaults the picture with the knife he used to kill Basil. Dorian's servants can hear the screams coming from the room down below. A painting of a young and beautiful Dorian is torn to pieces on the floor next to the old guy. The gems on the old man's neck let them recognize him as Dorian. Dorian Gray, a handsome young man at the start of the tale. He's innocent and naive, but he's also gullible. He's also a naive follower. Every time Lord Henry Wotton comes into his life, he's led down the path of debauchery. Lord Henry advises him to savor every moment of his youth because he will soon lose his enviable looks. By agreeing to enable Basil Hallward to age Dorian's portrait instead of him, Dorian is able to avoid aging himself. Because not only does it age, it also suffers from the ravages of drug usage and other immoralities, as he finds out. Dorian is adamant about living a hedonistic existence. Despite the fact that a guy of his social status would never have a relationship with an actress, he falls in love with an actress. Then Dorian goes one step further and asks her to marry him, which is in keeping with his personality. He, on the other hand, is too shallow to truly feel love, and he terminates their engagement when he loses interest. She kills herself because he has no remorse for his actions. There will be no guilt in his heart for the next 18 years, either, for any of the lives he ends up taking. The artwork breaks the enchantment and kills him, but after killing his friend he feels guilty and intends to destroy it. Basil Hallward, a gifted artist and the moral compass of the story. Basil is utterly enamored with Dorian at the start of the tale, to the point of idolatry. As much as he enjoys painting Dorian, he thinks his most recent depiction is his best. Basil wonders if he's poured too much of himself into the work. That he adores Dorian is evident in every brushstroke. However, when he no longer looks up to Dorian and spends time away from him, his devotion fades. For the first time in his life, Basil says that he's able to detach the work from himself. Visual art is almost always more esoteric than we expect. Form and color are all we need to know about form and color. Despite this, he continues to be concerned about Dorian. He visits Dorian after hearing reports about his extravagant lifestyle. His death is tragically caused by his anxiety. Lord Henry Wotton is a charming, witty, and well-educated member of the nobility. The majority of his beliefs are hedonistic, although he doesn't actually practice them. With just a few words in a book, he sets Dorian Gray on a path to self-destruction. With an air of superiority, he enjoys watching the people around him and making fun of their mistakes. To see the impressionable Dorian live out his life's maxims, he delivers him his clichés on the subject. Whenever Dorian harms someone, Lord Henry is the devil on Dorian's shoulder, providing him with ideas for devastation and justifications when it happens. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde was born in Dublin, Ireland, on October 16, 1854. An Irish-born English novelist and short story writer. The aesthetic movement that Wilde led was based on the notion of art just for the sake of art. Wilde was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, where he was exposed to some of the most outstanding literary conversations of the day. Afterwards, he attended Oxford University. During his time there, he achieved academic success in the classics and poetry, and revived the bohemian lifestyle of his youth. Long hair and velvet knee breeches were part of Wilde's look as an astute aesthete. Flowers, birds' feathers, and ceramics adorn his chambers. He aspired to the zenith of Chinese craftsmanship. Wilde's intellect, wit, and flair won him fans despite his oddities being mocked in journals and in Gilbert and Sullivan's comedic opera, Patience, 1891. Playwright and poet Oscar Wilde had a long and distinguished career. In 1881, he released his first collection of poems, which led to further success and lecture tours. He has 2 boys from his 1884 marriage to a wealthy Irish woman. After that, Wilde committed himself solely to writing. A number of his best works, including The Happy Prince, Dorian Gray, An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest, were written during this period. Many of his pieces are still being performed today, both on stage and in films. Oscar Wilde was entangled in one of the most exciting court cases of the century in 1895, when he was at the height of his fame. Lord Alfred Douglas was a close friend of Oscar's and rumored lover. The 9th Marquess of Queensberry, John Douglas, was an abusive father to Lord Douglas. Wilde bore the brunt of his son's immorality, which he found repulsive. Wilde sued the Marquess for publicly slandering him. Wilde was arrested for sodomy as a result of the Marquess' retaliatory measures. Oscar Wilde was convicted of sodomy after a lengthy and sexy trial. Lord Douglas was exiled and Wilde was condemned to 2 years of hard labor. After this, Wilde was broke and sad, and his writing took on a considerably darker tone as a result. After Wilde's release from prison, the two reunited, although they did not remain together. Douglas went on to take part in a number of legal battles to protect the rights of homosexuals. He wrote under the pseudonym Sebastian Melmoth for the remainder of his life and died in Paris, Oscar Wilde's final home. A few years ago, he decided to join the Roman Catholic Church. The Ballad of Reading Gaol, a poem depicting the harshness of prison life and the despair of inmates, was written at this time. Although it was released anonymously, it is hauntingly lovely. On November 30, 1900, Wilde succumbed of meningitis. Oscar Wilde was a great writer, yet he was ahead of his time. Even while his work was lauded, it was eclipsed by his homosexuality. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.